Thanks very much, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on. I'm delighted you could all make it, and thanks, Peter, for the invite. I was on a long promise to you to give a talk, so here we are. I came up with this title relatively quickly, actually, but I think it's nice. It kind of bookends what I want to talk about, which was, as Peter says, it's kind of the foundation of the Irish Free State in 1922. Right up to the recent, insofar as 2015, and I'll explain why 2015 in a little while. It's something I've been working on. I mean, I didn't really realise till I put pen to paper, as it were, for this. It's what I'm going to be talking to you about is based on a project that I've been working on with some colleagues in UCD, where I did my PhD, for the guts of over 10 years now, and it's quite a resource that I don't think has got the profile it deserves, although I want to show you something that did get a lot of public attention at the end. But it's actually been very influential internationally, in that we've a number of colleagues in other countries that are trying to do what we did for the Irish case. Now, what we did from the Irish case was kind of inspired by the Norwegian case, actually, which I'll explain to you in a second. But I'll just take you through the origins of the project, and then I'll show you some of the information about what Peter says is the evolution of it's. I suppose what I'm trying to do is just to think about looking at the Irish Free State / Republic of Ireland through a state administration lens. We know everything about the political party system, the electoral system. That's indeed what Irish political science is most famous for. The unusual electoral system, the longevity of, say, Fianna Fáil and power and so on. We know all this. We know the high politics. We kind of fairly good grasp on the economics. But actually the tradition of public administration research in Ireland is relatively weak. Kind of died off in the 1970s. Some big names like Basil Chubb, of course, who made no distinction between politics and administration when he wrote about Irish government. You're fine. Barrington, many of you would be familiar with, primarily associated with local government research. But we've actually very few public administration scholars. To be honest, on the island of Ireland, and I say this as somebody who's kind of tuned in more since I've come to work in Queen's in the local administrative history, and it's certainly there's not that much work there compared to other systems, as we'd see. So, by way of background, what happened was back in 2003, I was a PhD student in UCD, and with my then supervisor and some other colleagues, we created what we called a governance research group in the newly established Geary Institute for the Study of Social Change in UCD. And a lot of the interest there was around the whole issue of state capacity. So this very big question in social sciences of what does the state do? What does the state actually mean? What do we mean? What's the difference between the government and the state? How does the state deliver all that it does? And what has changed over time? I mean, the modern state delivers and does more things than anything in human history. Yet, of course, we're permanently unhappy with the state. We want more things all the time, even though the modern state is a very complicated, sophisticated organisation. But we're very interested in getting into that, getting into the black box. As I say, we know a lot about the politics, the high politics, the low politics. We know a bit about state architecture, but what about the evolution of that system? Because it tells us something about political values and political priorities, the way you organise your system of government, your civil service, your state agencies. What do you want it to do? Because this really reflects what the values you want to uphold, but also the things, the services that people would like to see from their government. Our inspiration for this was the one and only model at the time, which was the Norwegian State Administration Database. And in Norway, they've a very well-developed relationship between public bodies and universities, to the point where University of Bergen and the University of Oslo were funded by the government every year to produce a report on the evolution of the Norwegian state administration. And they've been doing this since 1947. So we were very interested to try and do something similar for the Irish case, to look at how the state has evolved in size and scope and in shape, in effect. And then we won some money in 2007, a major research grant from the then Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences, now just called the Irish Research Council. So at this stage, I was working in the place called the Institute of Public Administration, which is the Irish Public Service Training College. So I went part-time for 2 years to work on this project. And the key output of this project was a database of every single public organisation from 1922 to 2015. So this is the longest in the world, actually, because the Norwegian started in 1947 and moved forward. But we built a database that went back just short of a century, and indeed we've some ambition to make the 100 years with it. We're able to, the idea of the database was basically because to answer some of these basic questions about the relationship between the state and the society, or indeed the state and the market, you need to have some kind of understanding of the architecture of the state apparatus. What can it do, or what can it not do, indeed, is an important question. So we have some idea that within the black box, or the blue box, of government and public administration, stuff goes on, okay? Typically, an administrative system will collect information from the marketplace, from society. It will make sense of this. It will reduce it down. A lot of bureaucracy is about reductionism, reducing information down for policymakers, typically politicians, typically ministers, to establish priorities for allocating state resources. And then you get your decisions. What are we going to do? What are we going to spend our money on? What do we value? What do we prioritise? What can we not do? And so on. And then, of course, we have varying degrees of relationships between the state and society. There's various mechanisms through which the state has the state has its feelers in society to know what's going on, to, as I say, reflect what are deemed to be the priorities of society at any given time. So our focus here was trying to understand what goes on within here, because what goes on within here very much determines the outcomes, the quality of decision making, the quality of public policy. Okay, so what we did, we decided we needed to focus on think of the state as as an organisation, as one organisation, very sophisticated, very large one. To learn from other countries, particularly Norway, what had they done in terms of trying to get into the detail of their administrative system, and to be comprehensive for the Irish case. So to go from a particular point, so we chose, I think it was January 1922, where there was a key moment when the sort of Dublin Castle administration formally assigned responsibility for the state apparatus to the new Irish Free State. And there was a circular sent around going, nothing is to move unless it's by the say-so of these 9 new ministries. And this is a kind of a key moment in the new sort of Devo Max, or whatever you want to call it, Irish Free State. So this was a neat starting point for us in terms of the administrative autonomy, as it were. So we want to look at some questions around how state capacity has developed and spread over time, the developmental role of the state, how the state became to sort of promote the economy, to promote certain cultural values and norms, particularly through the means of the civil service. The original Irish civil service was to be a cultural vehicle in many respects. And indeed this idea of the Irish state being quite porous, where we have, for good or ill, where we typically associate clientelism with a negative interpretation of politics. But how porous was the state to outside interests, domestic and international interests over time? How could people get what they want into the black box of government? It's very regulated today, but in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, not so much. And then right up to the recent period, what has the effects of the financial crisis been? Quite dramatic in the Irish case compared to other countries, on the state's organisation and how the state has shrunk. How do you shrink a state? This is a question that consultants are paid a lot of money to do, so we really want to look at it from an academic perspective. So from 2008 onwards, the Irish crisis was one of the most severe in the world, and what happened to the state's bureaucracy because of that? Okay, so the story goes from one of the first agencies to be created by the Irish Free State, the Irish Film Censor's Office. Interestingly, again, there was a certain cultural values being established straight away in the new state, right up to the world's biggest property company upon a time, NAMA, the National Asset Management Agency. So these are, obviously two very different organisations, but they kind of bookend the story that I'm going to tell you about in terms of the Irish state's evolution and what the state did at different times in its development, because it doesn't always reflect the political priorities. What states actually do can often be you have to decouple from the political rhetoric from the actual practice of what the state delivers in terms of services, in terms of engagement with the marketplace. Okay, so the story is 1922, as I say, there's 9 new government departments or ministries established, roughly about 8,000 civil servants, a bit of a hiatus around the time of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And we leap forward to probably when it was at its largest, just around when the crisis happened in 2009, you've got 15 departments and 37,000, and that's the core part of the Irish state bureaucracy. Okay, the civil service has always been the core. It's the core policy making arena. It's about 10 to 13% of the wider public service, which is teachers, nurses, doctors, local government employees, health boards, you name it. Most public servants are the frontline staff, policing, teachers, nurses, and so on. So, as I say, so the story is how can we understand this evolution from a relatively small to relatively large state over time? So, what did we do? We tried to capture, as I say, every single thing, every single public organisation that existed from 1922 up to the modern period, and that was a big job. That took us 2 years longer than we thought, and a lot of archival research indeed, because for many years there's no records available. Records were burned, not in any conspiracies, but just for space-saving reasons. Government records were burned, certainly in the 30s, 40s, 50s. We had to go and do a lot of archival research because we found records about these organisations that existed and were very important, but actually their records were gone, departmental records were gone, so we had to go looking elsewhere for them. So we wanted to consider all public organisations, so all agencies, or what you might call quangos in today's terms, state-owned enterprises, the commercial state-owned companies, which are a very important part of the Irish state's evolution, and ministerial departments. So we consider them as a type of agency as well. And for each of these, so for each of these organisations, we attributed a series of characteristics. So when was it created? Was there any legislation creating it? What was its legal form? These are not straightforward questions at all. What did it do? In what policy domain, like health, agriculture, transport? How was it held accountable? Did it have a parent organisation? Physically, where was it located? Mainly Dublin, of course, but not always. Information on staffing and budgets. We actually, one of the original goals was to be able to plot the cost of running the Irish state and its services over time. But that was just a bridge too far. It took us the 3 years to actually develop this database on its own. So these are the organisational entities. So we ended up with, 680 or something like this. I'll show it to you. Does that have web access, Peter?
Yes.
Yeah, I might be able to show you this in a while. So we wanted to capture everything that moved over this 90-odd year period. But also, and this is where it got difficult, what happened to it. So we have the life cycle of every single organisation. Now, nobody else in the world has done this before. So any change to the organisation, but it gets quite difficult because not all organisations die a death. They merge with other organisations. So is that a death and a birth, or is it if an agency's merged into a ministry, we call this an absorption, or is it a death and a merger and so on? So there was all these definitional issues we had to deal with. Organisations that were privatised, organisations that were nationalised, organisations that were subsequently broken up and devolved to local authorities, or the reverse, functions performed at local authority level devolved upwards to a new national organisation. So you have all this movement, because states are always moving, there's always change going on in administrative systems. So the database we developed has two sets of data in it. The organisations, and for every organisation, its life cycle, what happened to it. Because otherwise you'd be missing things. If you were to just look at the state today, and look at the state in 1922, you'll miss all the things that came and went in between. And there's dozens of them, dozens of organisations that came and went in between. And this is where it got very interesting or very boring, depending on your outlook on the world and life. There is this issue of what is public, what is the state, what is publicness, what is stateness. Where do you draw the line between the state and the private sector? Okay, and the answer to that is it's impossible to draw that line. Every state will have this grey area that will be filled by what you might call third sector, voluntary organisations that perform public functions. Because when the state exits housing provision and the market won't provide it, well, charities have to step in there. Okay, so you'll have this grey area, but you move, and there's some sort of a continuum. Okay, if we move from legally created entities, for the lawyers in the room, this will be interesting, hopefully for you. So bodies created under law, conferred with state authority. You will be the agency for X. or the agency for Y, the agency to build motorways, and here's the piece of legislation creating it. And that's fine, we get that, that's a public body, no problem. We get into what if you've got a company set up that's 51% state-owned, 49% privately owned? Is this a state body? Well, okay, yeah, we'll say it is. Or there's a shareholding, 51% shareholding in it. Where it gets interesting, and where our database provoked a lot of interest, was when we went beyond what is immediately obviously public. Because a lot of public functions, well, not a lot, but many public functions in Ireland were delegated to ostensibly private organisations who had monopoly over the delivery of certain functions. Okay? And if you were to say to these organisations, we've included you in a database of public organisations, say, what are you talking about? We're a 100% private organisation. How dare you? But actually, you're the only body. So say something like the Bar Council of Ireland, right? Would consider itself a private body, but has sole authority over the regulation, the licensing, the sanctioning of people in the legal profession. And you don't have a choice. Okay, so this is a very important public function, but this is a private body. So we included this. We included universities. Again, I don't think anyone in UCD or Trinity would be too pleased to be considered an agency of the state. But in terms of our definition, we tried to have a very broad interpretation of what publicness was and what the state encompassed. It gets tricky because when we started out, when people said to us, we spoke to officials and say, what do you consider the state? So if you go to the Comptroller and Auditor General's office, they say, well, follow the money. Just see where does public money go? There's your answer. There's your public bodies. But if you follow the money, you'll quickly find yourself in lots and lots of charitable organisations that receive all or most of their money from the state, and you can't include them there. If you say follow the bodies that have legal character, that will leave you short as well. Not everybody delivering public services in Ireland has an independent legal statute attached to it. There are other things. We discovered, I wish we'd been more confident at the time, and we discovered not everybody was subject to the Office of the Ombudsman. If you go to the Ombudsman and say, well, surely they oversee the public administration, surely they know what the public administration consists of. Not at all. Lots of bodies they didn't know about. So this was we actually discovered before all these crises blew up in the Section 36 in the health sector, all these organisations delivering health services, but the CEOs were on these huge private sector salaries. And we had come across them, that these bodies had delegated authority to do public functions, but now you see it, now you don't. One minute they were public sector for some things, but they were private sector for others. So we had to make these calls about what's in and what's out of the state. And it goes right across to areas of modern regulatory governance where the state adopts standards that come from the private sector, okay, around weights or measurements and so on. So this, hopefully you get the point of saying it's very difficult to draw the line and say, this is the state, everything in here, that's your organisation. It's more fluid than that. And this is why a lot of people have come a cropper trying to count how many agencies are there, how many quangos are there. There's always too many, of course, in the media. We always need a bonfire of the quangos. But we took this very broad interpretation, as I say, of what the state means. Okay, so I'll focus first on the ministries. This is very brief, and then I'll give you the guts of what we discovered, and a lot of this will be in graphic, as in pictorial detail. So these are the original government Irish Free State departments, and if you look here, I call this the emergence period, kind of for that 25-year period right up to the end of World War II. What's interesting here is not a huge lot of change, you might say. This was a period primarily characterised by, single-party government between 32 and 48, as we'll see. But post-World War II, the emergence of what we, and similar to what's happening in Britain, of course, with the NHS, the emergence of the welfare state. Ministries are very important because they're a primary signal of political intent. Okay, it's much more evident nowadays where people put titles like, the Ministry for Innovation and Citizen Wellbeing and so on. But back in the day when it was just the functional focus, what are we doing? So the separation here of local government and public health into two ministries and a brand new ministry for social welfare. It's not unusual. This isn't an Irish story. That's not unusual for the period. But what is interesting is we see an expansion in the number of ministries as well. Because by 1937 we have the Constitution allowing for 15 ministries. The Irish Free State Constitution allowed for 12. And in 1922 there was only 9, as we'll see. Okay, so then we have the development period. This is a period, remember, the end of protectionism and so on, and the real opening up of the Irish state to the world and internationalisation. And we see what do we see here? Yeah, okay, so some more parts. Transport and power and a ministry for labour. So the state getting much more directly involved in industrial disputes and so on at this period as well. But still, again, not a lot of change for the first half century in terms of that top line stuff. Okay, you during this period you're beginning to have more changes of government. But there's still broad agreement on what the state should be doing. Okay, that's the development period, as I've called it, 1496. Then we see this modernisation period. Okay, EU membership and the demands coming with that. We see the names of the departments really beginning to diversify. A lot more chopping and changing. A lot more coalition governments. A couple of coalition governments is really the final period. So you see all this, particularly industry and commerce having lots and lots of name changes, tourism and transport being moved around, the marine becoming a big issue, energy. So this is the state getting into new areas, but also there's coalition politics at play here. And then finally, environment, of course, 1977, the environment becomes a big political issue as well, and economic planning, development, public service, these are smaller departments. And then this is the period of real complexity. It coincides, of course, with the economic boom. Governments have lots of money to do lots more things. The public want a lot more stuff. And so government is kind of pretty much unchangeable. The only 4 departments that don't see a name change are the 2 that are in the Constitution. So you can't really change the name. There has to be a Ministry for Finance. There has to be a departmentisation. Defence and Foreign Affairs are the only 2 for no particular reason. They're kind of discrete areas. Everything else undergoes change, has new tasks added to it and new things taken away from it. Now, when we started our project, we wanted to look at every ministry and look at within it and to look at the movement of divisions and try and establish priorities. It just proved impossible. It was impossible. We did 2 pilots on 2 departments, one in the 1970s and one in the 1990s. But there's neither rhyme nor reason to how government department, the subdivisions operated. So we just focused, first of all, on this top level, as I say, the primary organisational unit of the state, the government ministries, and we see this change over time. Now, what's also interesting is, well, what's going on during this period? These are more or less these same 4 periods again. So the emergence, development, modernisation, and, well, I call it complexity, but management and reform. There's a lot of ministerial reform during this period. You see a big change from primarily Fianna Fáil single-party governments, the move towards successful. Every government since 1989 until the current government, 2016, has been a coalition. The coalitions are trade-offs, and that's manifested in the ministries and the changes and who gets what and where. But you also see a much more churn, much more organisational change, much more energy and costs associated with this below the surface. So if we were to say during this period, it was very relatively few organisational changes in terms of new agencies being created and so on, or two agencies merging. When you get up to the modern period, I mean, there's almost 3 times as many going on. So it's just this over time, if you can imagine it like increasing or much more frequent cycles of organisational change. And this is important. This is it's directly related to administrative capacity, and how long does it take to undertake organisational change and to do multiple tasks at the same time. So we see, so this became evidence. This is from the second part of our database here. We have the units and then we have the events. Okay, so that was the ministries, and that's just some of the, some of the data on the number of changes over those 4 periods, and we see increasing frequency of